Hi, welcome to the January 11 meeting of the CNCF IoT Edge Working Group. For today's meeting, it's going to be relatively informal because I don't think we have much on the agenda. We do have a item being added now to review the Edge Native white paper. Dayan verbally submitted a topic, which is to discuss we've been invited to propose a talk for KubeCon Europe that I believe KubeCon Europe is in April. Am I right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. April.
And we've still got
Yeah.
a few weeks. Formally, those KubeCon maintainer track sessions for working groups were, I would contend, somewhat easy to get accepted, but they've run out of slots. And in particular, they're cutting the number of days in these KubeCon conferences down. So I think that will be pretty competitive, and it isn't a given we'll even get a session. But if membership has ideas for something that we could put on in Europe, let's go for it. So with that said, why don't I think Brandon, you're the one who put in that Edge Native white paper, so I'll turn it over to you, and I'll make you a co-presenter just in case you want to present anything.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And what I'm sharing is shortly before the break, let's see here. I think that's the window. Yeah. And I'll put a link to this doc in the chat as well. It should be visible and editable by everyone. So before the break, I copied what's in the GitHub repo into a Google Share doc because I thought that would be easier in terms of being able to review the doc comprehensively and provide an overall general edit for readability, completeness, correctness, etc. So I got started during the break and then ran into holiday activities, but then just yesterday got around to completing my edit. So in this doc, I marked all edits as suggested so that everyone can see what they are. There's not a lot. Most of what I changed was just for brevity and readability. Sometimes less is more. So in occasions where I thought we were maybe using extra words, I narrowed that down a little bit. But I think it was helpful to just read it from start to finish again with fresh eyes and taking a step back from being deep into the doc like we all were for several months. And I'll go through the edits just in a moment. There's not that many, but once we're all okay with the final product, what I'm recommending we do is make these edits in GitHub, first of all, and then secondly, take this draft back to the CNCF marketing working group, marketing committee, who I've been a part of now for several months. They've expressed a willingness to help us co-promote this paper now that it's reached this state of what we're calling, I guess, complete for now. We want to highlight the good work that we've done. We want to raise awareness across the CNCF community as well as the industry around these edge native principles. We want to start conversations. And then as we allude to at the end of the paper, we can talk about next steps, such as further revisions of this paper and additional follow-on papers as needed, perhaps addressing particular use cases, which we made a purposeful decision not to get into this time around. and the marketing committee can help us turn this into a more shareable format, a PDF, a design PDF with CNCF branding. An example of something like that would be the Cloud Native Security white paper they produced a couple years ago. And then we can also get this into their promotional and communications channels in terms of on their website, in the email promotional queue, and also on social media. And I think that's once we get this out there and publish it, we're sort of at the end of phase one of this paper. And then phase two becomes, whatever this group and the greater community wants to make of it, and wants to evolve it and take it from there. So I'll start here up at the beginning. We'll fill in the approximate date once we publish this latest version. Early on, what is Edge? These edits are just for, I think, flow. Here's some extra text I felt that wasn't necessary. Here I'm changing the headers a little bit to make them a little more succinct and a little more clear intrinsically, that we first call out the similarities, then we call out the differences, and then we get into the principles themselves. So as you can see, a really light edit, but that said, I would appreciate one or more people from this group to give those edits a sanity check to make sure that I haven't written over anything important or changed the meaning of anything in my edits. And reviewers can feel free to accept or reject the edits as they see fit. Here at the bottom, I updated the language a little bit for how to get involved. So we are reminding folks we're inviting them to come to this group to present their Edge related projects and to bring ideas to this group as the body that's creating and evolving this paper, and also participate in any future iteration of the paper or follow-up papers. Down in the author list, I changed the order here to make it alphabetical by company. I think that's usually how the Linux Foundation does it. And then we have our references, and then that's it. So any initial questions on any of that?
I didn't notice much well, summary is it looks really good, and it looks like you made this look better. The only thing that caught my eye is I think there was a section there that was promoting, I don't know, some estimated figures of growth right at the top under what is Edge.
Okay.
And I don't know, it might just be me, but it just sometimes seems promotional, and you can kind of draw these numbers on Edge or kind of any other topic in tech. If you look hard, if you unleash the Google search engine,
right,
you can find random hockey stick growth forecasts on just about anything. Some of them tend to be better than others over time if you go back and review them. But
yep.
I'm not sure that this one, how did you come up with this particular one versus others? And I think that there are some that come right out of CNCF materials that maybe are kind of more vendor neutral, and I wasn't familiar with this one. I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just it caught my eye when you were scrolling through.
It's been maybe 5 months since we put our initial draft together, so I don't recall the reasoning behind it. I guess the question is, do we need a sentence that reminds the audience of the rapid projected growth of this technology, or if we do feel it's necessary, yeah, maybe we look to get something that's been numbers that have been used by the Linux Foundation. That might be a safer way to go. Or if we don't think it's necessary at all, I think we could maybe remove that line and just jump in about
Yeah.
the benefits.
Well, we
Yeah,
don't have
so
to solve it here, but yeah,
Yeah, so I'm
Eileen,
actually the one that put that in there. And the
Uh-huh.
reason that I had initially put that in there is because we were talking about the definition of edge. And I also wanted to just kind of highlight where it was going and the growth in the industry.
okay.
And in my particular role at VMware, this is one of the areas that I actually work in. And so that's why I put it in there. But if you guys don't think it's necessary, then feel free to take it out.
Yeah, I'm kind of neutral, and I just was more curious about where that came from and, you know, why that one versus other ones out there. But yeah, that's a decent explanation.
Any other thoughts from the group on the keeping this in or perhaps taking it out?
But I think there is a link to a document that is the base for these numbers, right?
Yes, it goes to a page from Grandview Research.
Okay.
Which has a report available.
So based on that research, these numbers are accurate. The fact that the reader can take it seriously or not is up to them. As long as there is a source, I don't see a.
Okay, that sounds good.
It's my opinion. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
As long as we say this is where it's coming from, that should be okay.
Yeah, I probably agree with that.
Yeah, sounds good to me. Okay.
Okay.
Anyway, that was my only comment. So
Okay.
I'll mute my mic and turn it over to others if they.
Happy to discuss any other thoughts as it is now. But what I'd like to do is allow folks to maybe go through and review each one of these changes in a little bit more detail if this group would be willing to spare some time. So how about we give folks until, let's say, the end of this week to make any additional tweaks as needed. Otherwise, I'll accept all these changes, turn this over to the marketing committee, look to get it updated on GitHub, and then as their promotional cycles develop and this gets inserted into it, I can periodically report back to this group on when to expect the PDF version. I suspect people on this call would find that a useful document as well to share amongst your teams or in your own communities as well. And then yeah, we can look to see where it goes from there. So it's exciting to see kind of the full evolution of what we've been working on, and I'm glad that we seem to have found a niche that needed some filling in terms of definitions and leadership and innovation. So we're close to calling this done for now, and then yeah, we'll see what we need to do with this into the future.
Let me just close and let's verify that is everybody on this call is end of this week enough. And we do have some people who couldn't make this meeting, like Kate. So maybe if you wouldn't mind putting a note out on the Slack channel indicating the same thing, just in case somebody didn't make this meeting and isn't aware that this happened and is going on.
Sure.
And anyway, last call, if anybody here wants a little more time than end of this week, speak up, because we could just say 1 week from today instead, but you know, otherwise we'll take silence as end of this week is okay. All right, there you go, Brandon. And maybe
Okay.
I'm just thinking more of Kate not being here, but if you wouldn't
Okay.
mind just putting a note out in the Slack channel, just
I will.
stating what you just
And
said, that'd be great.
I will, and I'll flag her as
right.
well, let her know, and go from there.
Okay, moving on in the agenda, I put the item of, we touched on it briefly at the open, but the KubeCon maintainer track talk proposal. Dayan, did you have any specific ideas of what direction you wanted to go with that, or anybody else who's on this call? If you've got anything, you know, any ideas that you personally would like to work on, or maybe just throw it out there for others to put together the talk proposal, but things that you would like to see as a presentation yourself.
So from my perspective, that was just the first idea that I come up with, like trying to get all these principles detailed in the paper into something that is more practical. Yeah, and it was open. So I'm not still sure how much time commitment I would have to actually do a proper build, but I think we can still go with it in some sense if there's no other proposals. So Kate also suggested panel kind of session. So and that's where we left, right? So over the holiday, people to think about.
I think a few other ideas were, well, we could do like white paper version 2, which we had at KubeCon North America, an update. If we make some movement on that effort to catalog open source edge related projects, we could conceivably have a talk just giving a lay of the land of what's out there and what category. I think that the state of that spreadsheet is probably significantly less than half complete. So that might be a stretch to get it done by then, but I think it could be done if several people were to get together and work on it. And then to fill in a little more detail on that panel idea, I think we had discussed in December the idea that it would be great if that panel would include some user case study kind of things. That I think that to get traction on that, to make it more attractive to people on the program committee to accept, it would be great if we could have some user stories on applying edge native principles, in actual projects. And given that it's KubeCon Europe, if these people were Europe-based, that would be great as well. So we had been talking about anybody who happens to know instances of end users putting things together as opposed to just having it vendor driven. Okay. So we do have a few weeks, but this is probably something we need to start moving on because, it isn't going to come together well if we procrastinate and wait for the last day. So maybe anybody interested, let's start putting together a chat on this in Slack to try to move this forward. Okay. The final thing that I had dropped into the agenda was this ongoing spreadsheet with the edge native apps. Let me go drop that into the chat too for people who don't have the document open. So this is just an attempt to catalog edge related open source projects. And like I say, we're up to 27 projects in there right now. I believe that there's a lot more of these that are missing. I think Eclipse Foundation alone contends that they are sponsoring 60. Now, a lot of those might be sort of in the retired state, but there's a lot of them out there. So I don't expect this to be edited on the call, but I'd like to remind people that if they've got anything that they work on, that they use, whatever, let's try to get the things in there, because I think we can perform a service to the community by putting together this list. It's actually like I've come across incidents where I'm looking for a solution to a problem, and having one place to look rather than Googling for things like, I don't know, IoT device management or something that would manage firmware updates at Edge, is something that you can spend a few hours on, because there doesn't seem to be a good comprehensive source of where to go to. The closest thing to it is selected foundations like Linux Foundation, LF Edge, and CNCF do have a portal where they list the projects that they maintain, but kind of this overall cross industry, across the world catalog of these, I haven't come across it, and it would be nice if it existed. And maybe this is an opportunity for this group to perform a useful service by putting something in place to maintain such a thing.
I think this sounds great. I definitely second the comment you made about it being difficult to find a master list of what's out there. One other thing I've found when looking at these projects is often it's hard to understand what applications would sit on top of these edge systems and which systems would be better suited for one type of application or another. So to cite a specific example, EdgeX Foundry, for example, has more of like an industrial consumer slant where you'd need to do protocol translation, whereas something like Acri is better focused for incorporating devices that may not be part of the cluster, where you need to run a service on the cluster in order to accommodate those third-party devices. And if there was some way we could capture that essence of the use case or the application, I think that could be really useful to people.
Yeah. My expectation here is once we get a list of just everything, we would then do an analysis of pigeonholing them into categories. Because I think you look at things like Acri, that's very niche. It has one job, kind of, that they claim the original principle of Unix was that you had tools that do one thing. But some of these projects, like you brought up EdgeX Foundry, they're really wrappers. And the project itself includes a lot of specialized tools. But really, the EdgeX Foundry itself, I view as an integration of a collection of tools, more along the lines of, hey, it's a Swiss Army knife, if you will, versus some of these being purpose-built for one application. And I think where we'd go once we had the list is we would break them down into these categories. And there is usefulness to the Swiss Army knife idea that, you know, if you're a user and you've just got a problem to solve and you want to go to one place, you maybe the effort of choosing best of breed fork and best of breed knife and then integrating it together lays a big job of that integration of gluing these pieces together on you, and going after kind of a comprehensive suite of things that have been designed together and are tested together does have some attraction. And I think that that where this will fall once we get the list is that we will have some of these projects that turn out to be more like integration projects, if you will. You know, there's some of these that integrate a bunch of components at Edge, and also some that integrate management in a public cloud with Edge leaf nodes, and another form of integration that is indeed useful. I mean, you know it's useful because there's so many of them out there. The other interesting thing that I think would fall out of this is that I think one of the fallouts of there not being this comprehensive list is I'm afraid that maybe a neutral outside observer could come to the conclusion that there's been a lot of reinvention of the wheel going on here, that maybe 5 people went and did effectively independent solutions of the same problem. And had they been aware that these other things existed, this isn't the most efficient use of resource in the world to have that come about. There might be an opportunity to merge these independent projects together, or if you were an end user, you'd want to sort of evaluate these to pick and choose which one of these you thought was best matched to solve your problem. And kind of looking ahead on the chessboard 2 or 3 moves ahead, I think once you have the list and categorize it, you maybe even could do the world some good by doing kind of some letter grade health ratings on these. Like one thing you find in open source is projects that are out on GitHub that nobody's done a source code check in 2 years, and there doesn't appear to be any recent activity, and it's kind of a red flag that maybe if there are other solutions that are more actively maintained, they might be a better choice for you, just because you don't want to, in the current state of the world with security risks, kind of anything that nobody's paying attention to and is sat dormant for a couple of years just smells to me like security incident waiting to happen. And I think that there's a lot of runway here for taking this idea of the catalog and advancing it to be a really useful source for people working in this space.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, my personal experience was last fall. I came across K3 AI, which sounded like a great edge type application to deploy machine learning using K3S to edge devices. But just as you said, I think there was a lot of gusto at the beginning of the project, and then some of the involvement trailed off over 2022. So when I came to the project, I found that things didn't work, and being able to provide some of that insight to people would help save them some time. My suggestion is we might want to consider an approach that's not going to be too judgmental for smaller fledgling projects, so that we kind of set appropriate expectations. So a small team of like 2 or 3 people don't get overwhelmed by an influx of people suddenly paying attention to their project. We need to find some way of like indicating the scale and grandeur of the projects that they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. The other thing is, if we went so far as to sort of give grades on the health of a project, that is, that's an opportunity where some people might take offense, and it would be key that these not be opinions. They have to be, objective metrics, things like, how many committers have been active in the project in the past year, or, it's the same criteria actually that the CNCF uses to allow something to become sandbox or incubating as a project. They have published standards for some of the health metrics they're going to take into account. You can't take any random piece of source code and expect the CNCF to accept it as a sandbox. There has to be a proposal with actual metrics collected and presented. Mm-hmm. And I think something like that is the direction this would have to go, where it would be, so, there are a number of numbers that you can get on GitHub, things like how long does it take for PRs to be accepted? Because, some of these dormant projects, what happens is people will even submit enhancements to it, but if nobody who has approval authority is paying attention, they just sit there aging and nothing gets done. And I think there's opportunities to go somewhere with this. I did bring out the idea that if we got this together by KubeCon Europe, this might be a really good presentation. But, as I talk about the scope of this, of filling out that thing, categorizing them and everything, I think it's a real stretch to expect to be near publication within a couple months. This, I think, is a pretty big job potentially.
I'd be happy to toss in my hat to help you with this.
Okay.
One other metric that I'd recommend that might be contentious, so I bring it up now, is I often look to see if there's governance that goes beyond just the company that open sourced the project.
Mhm.
I think that would be useful for people to see if others have gotten involved than just the people that originally wrote it.
Yeah, I think maybe columns that would be interesting are if there is a governing body, whether it be CNCF, LF Edge, Eclipse, it should be listed. And then if there isn't, many times, maybe most times, there really is one entity, whether it be a company or whatever, that sponsored this. And I think that sometimes that actually isn't easy to find, but it's generally out there. But sometimes they don't actually put it in the documentation that company X is the originator of this. And you kind of have to deduce it by looking at who the committers are, looking up their GitHub accounts and figuring out who they're working for. And you spot a trend that, gee, everybody who worked on this project for the first 6 months came out of this one organization. But as a potential user, I'd like to know that, because it kind of tells me whether some organization out there in the world has skin in the game as a commercial, in a commercial sense, to not abandon this thing. And there are some who maybe don't like the idea of it being corporate, meaning that they want everything to be free. But I think another attitude is that you actually want, any software engineer has to eat and get housing, and somebody has to pay for that. And often these projects don't go well when there really isn't some commercial activity associated with them to fund the operations. So, but anyway, if you want to help out on this, this is great. I posted the link in the chat to the actual spreadsheet. Feel free to add columns, or, we originally had this hope that maybe was a little naive, that people from these projects would discover this on their own. And I think in retrospect, they don't even know we exist. So I think that part of this is going to come down to us having to add lines to this table ourselves to fill in what we're aware is out there.
Okay, sounds great. I'm adding an entry now.
Okay, thanks. So I think that was the last item on our agenda, and historic. We generally then just turn this over to just kind of birds of a feather discussion. So anybody who wants anything, I'm going to just seed this birds of a feather by just bring up if you've come across anything interesting in the field of IoT Edge. And one thing that has been captivating me is I've just been hearing all of this, I don't know if it's hype or reality, but talk about this Chat GPT being the hottest thing in tech. There's some people suggesting that Chat GPT might potentially even supplant things like Google search, because it's something, if you're not familiar with it, where you can talk to an AI, ask it questions, or even ask it for assignments like, write a paper on this. And there's some people suggesting this is a serious challenge to educational institutions, because students can ask Chat GPT to write papers for them. And where does this intersect with the Edge? Well, I came across people who were talking about having Chat GPT put together scripts for Home Assistant and for Node-RED, which is kind of a flow-based development tool that is often used for Edge applications with devices. I think, Dayan, you've talked about Node-RED in the past in presentations, but it kind of surprised me that people reported that they said that they were able to verbally go to ChatGPT, say, write me a script to turn on the light when the temperature drops below 32 degrees in my home automation system, and it actually worked. And that just kind of flabbergasted me, that they said that it came up with like either fully working or close to working code examples that they could use in some of these tools. Now, I don't know that anybody in industrial IoT is going to trust that with refinery control, but often these things sort of creep up from kind of, the casual hobbyist kind of things and grow into a niche. And I just found that fascinating. So just wanted to throw that out there if people hadn't heard of that before. Anyway, I'll give up the mic, and if anybody else has any topics at all, just out of the blue that they want to bring up for birds of a feather related to Edge or IoT, go for it.
I was wondering, now that we've moved the working group under CNCF and not necessarily directly under Kubernetes, is there interest in looking at orchestrators, like other orchestrators other than Kubernetes?
Yes, certainly. I think that was one of the major underpinnings with why the move happened. I think we had quite a few conclusions come up both in meetings and in presentations that Kubernetes doesn't solve all the problems. And part of the reason why it moved over is an acknowledgement that Kubernetes has fairly significant resource demands for low resource device edge, for example. The fact is, on some of these devices, they really can't even support Linux, much less a container runtime and then loading a Kubernetes, even a thin Kubernetes on top of it. So the move was in recognition of that, I would contend, and making it broader based, not just in terms of orchestrators, but solutions in general. So this whole scope of it being, our constraints are, in my mind, that it be open source. We're not here to pitch commercial projects. If commercial things happen to have an open source dotted line, that's fine. But this is open source focused, but if that checkbox is done and it's Edge or IoT, then it's good.
When I last looked at it like 4 years ago, I was seeing things like Mesosphere, Kubernetes, Nomad, and all sorts of others contending to be the orchestrator. I think in some ways, a lot of them got eliminated when Kubernetes rose to prominence. But my gut is that there's a bunch of orchestrators that I see emerging now that are new. This leads me to believe I need to go out and make a new list of what's out there, because things have gone and new things have emerged. Is that perhaps an endeavor that we want to do in the working group?
I think so. And once again, I would think that those orchestrators would appear in that list of open source projects. So I can tell you that Nomad is alive and well in this space as an orchestrator. And I haven't personally used it, but there are certainly many. You can readily just search for YouTube and find people who have given YouTube videos about using Nomad for edge use cases. And it's my understanding it's potentially thinner than Kubernetes. I believe we've had a presenter in this group from Portainer who brought that up in a presentation on Portainer. Portainer supports hosting things at edge nodes on just a bare Docker runtime with Docker Compose, with Kubernetes and with Nomad. And all of those are potentially options. And I believe that speaker suggested that Nomad is lower in resource demands than Kubernetes. So that one didn't drop. I think that you brought up Apache Mesos. I think that one is effectively dead for edge. It's kind of losing momentum, but that one to some extent had bigger resource demands than even Kubernetes. It was similar in that it used Zookeeper instead of etcd, but the Zookeeper component alone was pretty resource intensive. And landing a full Mesos cluster at an edge node would be a challenge, to put it mildly. And I do have some experience with deploying Mesos clusters, so I'm not that one. I'm speaking from personal experience, and I think even the company behind Mesos, which was originally Mesosphere, now rebranded as D2IQ, has moved on to being Kubernetes specific. But in terms of orchestrators, there's anything from the no orchestrator option to using just a bare Docker runtime, and conceivably the Docker runtime could be driven by something like GitOps. So in a way, you could have a supervisory system populating a Git repository that really is driving what happens at edge nodes. Or you could take it up to orchestrators. And I think it's a pretty broad and open area at this point in time where there's no one obvious winner. Like Kubernetes, I would contend, sort of has become dominant in the public cloud large data center space as an orchestrator. But when you get to edge, I think it's still greenfield. Other things that are out there that I'm aware of, the WebAssembly people have a niche of people in WebAssembly that are talking about displacing Docker as the container engine because the WebAssemblies are potentially smaller in terms of resource demand and for sending them on the wire to get your apps out to edge. And if you circulate in that community, there have been attempts to modify Kubernetes to get it to orchestrate WebAssemblies. But I think that there's at least a 50% consensus that they think that ultimately the Kubernetes is a stopgap just to get you a mechanism to work on things for now. But that if WebAssembly catches on, there are enough different aspects about it that maybe a new orchestrator is called for to handle WebAssembly packaging out at edge. I'm also familiar with.
If I'm correct, I think the Spin project that Kate is working on is using Nomad as an orchestrator for WebAssembly cloud, basically.
Okay.
What was the
And-
name you mentioned, Dejan? Know it?
Nomad.
Nomad, yeah, Nomad.
Okay.
And the project is Spin, I think. Let me find you a link.
And when they're replacing Docker, Steve, they're getting rid of OCI containers entirely? Like they're not just getting
No.
rid of the Docker, they're getting rid of Containerd and all open source alternatives as well?
Well, I think that what's going on is they still are using OCI containers. There's an awful lot of use of OCI containers for things other than Dockerized applications. So it is pretty mainstream now, I think, to package WebAssembly in an OCI container. But you wouldn't necessarily then use the Docker runtime at the edge location to run it. You might use something else. But the advantage of putting it in an OCI container is you can use Docker container repositories, anything from the Docker Hub code itself to something like the open source Harbor project. And there's a number of options for running container registries. It's just like container registries have morphed to hold Helm charts as well in some cases. And they're just sort of a generalized distribution mechanism with some governance so that you can put things out there that get distributed to nodes that are going to run them. So I think OCI is very much alive and well, even with WebAssembly, but the orchestrator and the runtime is something that maybe not so much. Now, I think that some of the Docker runtimes actually have recently advertised the ability to actually run WebAssemblies in addition to Docker. So that is out there too. Whether that's a wise decision or not, I don't know. It smells a little Swiss Army knife-ish, so that if you maybe are only running WebAssembly, maybe something purpose-built for just that would work a little better. But what would I know? I'm not working on it myself, but that kind of thing is out there.
What you just
No,
mentioned using
I think
sorry, go ahead, Dejan.
Just wanted to say that, yeah, I think the Docker now officially supports running the WASM payloads. packaged as OCI containers. Yeah. Let me, at least I'm just sending links in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
I think
that's-
actually at
that's
KubeCon,
without the
Docker announced that,
orchestra.
right? The Docker Inc. But then there's other runtimes like Podman,
Yeah.
for example. So I don't know what their
Yeah.
state is, but that is a
That's true as
trend
well.
that they maybe are getting combined even by some mainstream runtimes.
Yeah.
I know that with regards to the using the container registry as a general artifact registry, they've added support for Helm and storing Helm charts inside. For the purpose of this group, it might be interesting to look into storing other build artifacts for edge devices inside of the OCI registry as a service, because you could start to use it for storing things like firmware or other small artifacts that you might want to distribute to your edge nodes.
Yeah. Another thing I found is that OCI containers are being used for is potentially even the OS itself, you know. So originally Docker reuses the kernel of the host. So the expectation is that it is additive to whatever Linux kernel is found on the host. But as I understand it, it turns out that there was nothing in the OCI spec that precluded you from putting a full Linux kernel in that container. It was simply that when Docker came about, you know, nobody did it because you were expecting to layer on top of the host's existing OS. So I believe that there are edge targeted Linux distributions that utilize an OCI runtime to actually package the Linux kernel itself and use this to manage to do updates at edge nodes, which is otherwise a challenge. You know, if you say I'm going to run Docker applications out in an edge node and use Docker to send the application there, well, Linux itself is going to have CVEs discovered. How do you keep that patched? And it would be nice if you could use exactly that same paradigm that you're using to patch the applications itself to patch the operating system to perform updates. And I believe that there are some Linux distro solutions, I haven't used them myself, that try to use that mechanism to distribute the OS inside an OCI container.
Yeah, and I think in those cases, they may be deploying a container with the tools necessary to rewrite the bootloader, and they might be reaching around and updating the kernel that way, and the container becomes a delivery mechanism. But it would be interesting to document those and see what tricks they use.
Yeah, and as long as you had enough resource to run even Docker, of course, for firmware updates, as long as you could do a hot firmware update, meaning that the operating system is still running while you do it, I don't see any reason why you couldn't write a conventional Docker app that simply went out to the edge node, got triggered, and manages to pull off the firmware update. It's just that some of these firmware updates require a reboot process, and that might potentially be problematic. But if you could do it while the thing is running, which is often the case for something like a plug-in IO board, you know, in a mainstream full-out x86 server, for example, you might have firmware on network cards and on storage host bus adapters. And I think those generally can be applied hot. But if it is targeting kind of the motherboard and, you know, memory interface controller or something like that, that's going to require sort of the power cycle reboot, to which might be problematic to pull off in a conventional application.
Yeah. Related to this, conventional Docker containers often look like layer cakes, where each layer being added has smaller footprint than the one underneath it, or maybe that's not entirely correct, but you assume that you're layering them like a giant stack of plates. There are projects like build packs, which are trying to use the layers as independent packages that you can combine in different combinations. And that could be useful for edge devices because you could use it to get a finer level of granularity for your layers and then combine them in the combination you want rather than the way that they were put together by the container developer.
Mhm.
So things like instead of pulling down entire Ubuntu base image with 200 or 400 packages all in the same tarball, you might just pull down a single tarball for grep, and that essentially becomes the layer that you add to your previous base image. Check out build packs if you want to see the concept. It's still sort of being worked out.
Okay, sounds good. Back to your whole orchestrator thing, I'll throw one other thing out there that I've been kind of keeping tabs on, and that's this one isn't foundation based, but AWS Greengrass is open source. They have an Amazon hosted repo that has the source code for it. And I think that I would contend that Greengrass is a concept where there's a cloud hosted management layer, but out at the edge nodes, you would run applications and that the system could be viewed as a form of orchestrator. And it is not Docker specific, I believe, with Greengrass. Once again, I haven't gone and taken it to the next level of actually deploying it and playing with it, but I think that you can run apps that are potentially not Docker based and maybe not even Linux based with that Greengrass system.
Interesting. I didn't know they'd open source version 2.
I know they went from 1 to 2, and I guess I just blatantly assumed that if the first one was open source, that the second one is too. But maybe that is an issue. I don't know.
Yeah, that is interesting. That of course switched from Golang to Java, if you weren't aware. So that might introduce some complications.
But I think in that commercial space that Amazon and Microsoft, I think, might have things going on there that are open source, meaning that if they're open source with an appropriate license, they're within scope of this working group. So, if we're keeping a list, they belong on it. But they might be viewed as niche if they are running their own ecosystem and haven't gotten enough adoption that people are discovering ways to use them independently. But if they're open source, it should be at least theoretically possible to use them without using AWS.
Yeah, I've played with Greengrass and I liked the premise of the solution, so I would be in favor of adding it to the list.
Mm-hmm.
And Stephen, this is Brandon. I don't know if you've brought the list to the attention explicitly to the LF Edge umbrella project. I see a couple LF Edge projects here, Crano and EdgeX Foundry, but I know that group is at least a dozen or so projects. I would imagine all of them would qualify for inclusion on this list.
Yeah, I have a private spreadsheet. I kind of fork this, and I was kind of aspiring that people associated with the projects would directly compose their own rows in this table, but it hasn't happened. So I'm on sometime in the next few weeks, I'm going to go add to this list in a big dump. And all of the Linux LF Edge projects are on my list, as well as all the Eclipse, I believe, or at least Eclipse has a concept of kind of active projects and ones that have gone dormant. I forget their exact label, whether they call it archive or something, but I'll at least put the live Eclipse ones in there as well.
Okay, sounds good.
Speaking of Eclipse, let me have one other final thing. If somebody else wants to bring up a subject, that it'll take me a minute to look this up, but there is a book that was written by the person who runs open source community for the Eclipse Foundation. And I went and ordered the book, and it's due to arrive tomorrow. So I can't say I've actually read this yet, but it's Frederick Dabian of the Eclipse Foundation, and I've seen him talk before, and he gives very good talks, so I suspect his book is good. Here, I just dropped a link to that book in the chat. It's called Building Enterprise IoT Solutions. It specifically calls out with Eclipse IoT technologies, but I believe that this goes into more generalized coverage as well with other open source projects. And this is fresh off the press. Like I think that it just got printed within the last week.
Has Frederic attended these meetings?
Yeah, he does show up occasionally.
Okay. Yeah, I know that Eclipse has like HANA and a bunch of other things that would be relevant to that list.
Yeah, I know I've run into him at conferences, and he's been working on this book for about a year. So there's probably a lot of work behind this. Okay, if nobody's got anything else, we're almost at the top of the hour. Well, we are now. So maybe last call, any final things people want to bring up, or even things you want to nominate for discussion at the next meeting in 2 weeks. If not, thanks for attending, and we'll see you at the next meeting in 2 weeks. Bye.
Thanks all.